This video is brought to you by the 3 Minute Board Games patrons. Keep us independent by supporting us on Patreon. Kia ora koutou and welcome to this video about the great board games coming out of Aotearoa New Zealand. What's Aotearoa, you ask? Well, this country has two names. The first of which is New Zealand, which makes us the new version of an island from Denmark. And I'm pretty sure 95% of the people who live in this country couldn't find Old Zealand on a map. And then there's the Maori name for the country, Aotearoa, which means the land of the long white cloud, and personally I just prefer that name immensely. So from this point in the video, I'll be referring to the game designs of Aotearoa. And while many of you will know some of the big game design names in Aotearoa, some of these names on here might surprise you. Plus there's also other designers and other publishers I'd like to showcase in this video. Anyway, let's move on to the list. We're going to start off with Aotearoa's biggest publisher in terms of overall budget, and that's Weta Workshop. Now, Weta made their name by making the Lord of the Rings films and then doing video graphics and CGI stuff for a whole bunch of films. But they've also had a moderately to not so successful board game development line as well. They've put out 3 games, of which one is a standout, and that is GKR Heavy Hitters. This giant robot fighting game has eye-popping production values, great art, and fantastic miniatures. And for all that flash and bang, it's also still a very good mech fighting game. And funnily enough, the global launch of GKR Heavy Hitters, where they invited people around to Weta Workshop to pick up the games and get them signed, was literally a few weeks before I decided to kick off the channel, so GKR was one of the first games we covered. Now, I was pretty high up on Weta after GKR. I thought, wow, this is a great way for a design company like this to do something cool in board gaming. And then they did District 9, and that game is utterly terrible. But if you have the budget for it and you can track down a copy of GKR, it is a really cool mech fighting game. Now, the people who worked for Weta and did GKR started up their own company called Maori Games, and their very first game coming out was Shelfie Stacker, designed by New Zealand's very own pop culture board game design icon, Shem Phillips. Shelfie Stacker is a pretty fun little game about being a board game collector trying to stuff a 5x5 Kallax. It's in a similar model to games like Sagrada, where you're drafting dice and trying to get them into the right places. And while Shelfie Stacker was a good, nice, safe entry for a company to do as their very first Kickstarter game, you should keep an eye out for Arcus's next game, Dreadful Meadows. The art for this is really cool, and the designer is someone I really admire. And that's Lucas Adam, the designer of Galilean Moons. Now, long-time listeners to the channel will know that I'm a big booster for Galilean Moons. I played Lucas's demo of the game well before it went to Kickstarter and was absolutely adamant he should take it out there so other people could play it, because it's a great area control game. It's got emerging powers, it's got simple core rules, but there's a lot of great decision points in the game. I think it's a masterclass in how to design an area control game. That one went up to Kickstarter, it funded, there are copies out there, but it's not exactly in retail globally, so it might be a bit tricky to track down. But after seeing Lucas's first ever game design, Galilean Moons, be something I love so much, I'm really keen to see what he does with Dreadful Meadows. Now, popping back to Weta Workshop for a bit, they did a third game called The Hobbit, An Unexpected Party. Now, I haven't played this one, as The Hobbit's not really my jam, but it was designed by Jarrett Gray. And Jarrett is a very long-term friend of mine. I've known him for well over 20 years, just through gaming and other things. And for the longest time, I had no idea he'd designed an incredibly successful game back in 2009, and that's Endeavour, which a few years back got re-released as Endeavour Age of Sail. Now, mechanically, Endeavour is a brilliant game, as you build buildings, try to collect influence, and, try to take over the world colonial styles. The reason it hasn't appeared on the channel is the game has this slavery mechanic in it, and I've always felt uncomfortable being, a European guy down in New Zealand talking about whether slavery was implemented well in a game or not. Just seemed like not my place to speak on that. So yeah, while the mechanics and stuff are really good, it's just an awkward game to talk about. But thankfully Jarrett and Carl, the two designers of Endeavour, have agreed with that, and they're putting out a new version of the game called Endeavour Deep Sea, where instead of colonialism, it's about maritime research. Now, I don't want to bang this drum over and over again, but sometimes I feel I have to, and it's the idea that, does your game need a colonial theme? Is that colonial thing actually adding anything to the game? Could it be about something different? And here we're going to see Endeavour, an incredibly colonial themed game, rethemed into maritime research, and I'm really interested to see how that turns out. Keep an eye on this one in 2023. Next up, we'll be talking about Amanda Milne's company, Shill Mill Games, and they've put out things like Manifest, Komodo, and most famously, Australia by Martin Wallace. Now, the irony that a New Zealand published, British designed game about Australia exists is not lost on me. But if you're unfamiliar with Australia, it's this wacky Trains versus Cthulhu game that shouldn't work, but it does. It's actually a really clever, fun, and interesting game, but what a premise. Like, I think in the review I said it was a bit of an acid trip, whoever came up with the idea for this, but there you have it. The Australia Big Box came out recently, and if you really want to get into Australia and get all the stuff, that's the way to go about doing it. Now, Amanda and Martin Wallace are teaming up on a new game. It's called Monster Rock, and it's about 1970s heavy metal. So keep an eye out for that one. It's still in playtesting and development, but it is a collaboration between Amanda and Martin, and should be very, very interesting to see how that game turns out. Now, Shield Mill Games was formed by Amanda Mill and Julia Schiller. They amicably split some time ago, and Julia went on to start her own company, Cheeky Parrot. Now, Cheeky Parrot's all about small box games, and I've covered quite a few of them on the channel in the past, usually in my obscure games videos because they're only really available inside Aotearoa. But there's been fun stuff like World Changers, Horde, and Flipology. Now, Flipology is a really basic game. It's put down these animals, each of them has a power. When you turn one animal over, it will cause a chain reaction. Rounds are over in like 5 minutes, but these 3 or 4 decision points you make through the game are really, really clever, and these chain effects that just pop things up and pop other people's stuff up, just lots of fun. And I really like Julia's niche, these games that just pop up in bookstores, these small box games that pretty much family friendly, easily accessible, child friendly sort of stuff that pretty much anyone out there can pick up and play, as long as you can get your hands on them, because they're mostly, as I say, only available here in Aotearoa. Now I'm going to do a quick run through on some of the other smaller designers and publishers out there. We've got Maddie T with Kitos, this excellent word card game that I think should be in every toy store in the English-speaking world. Maddie's been trying hard to sell it to one of the big toy companies, but he's had no luck so far. But this is a great little word game and really should be more successful than it is. Then we've got Takashi Sawada with Floating Floors, a neat little dexterity game that went on Kickstarter earlier this year. Then we've got Alan Clint with Game Time Again, and they put out fun little games like Upkeep. But they do have a game coming up that looks really, really neat, novel, and interesting, and that's Perpetuity. Now, this one went up to Kickstarter. They pulled it back down, but I'm really interested to see the reboot of this. I couldn't get to cover it on the Kickstarter when it went live because I was in the middle of moving house. Hopefully I can give this one a bit of a boost because I really like the novel planets rotating system thingy that they use in this game. It looks different, it looks novel, it looks interesting, and that's what I'm all about. We've also got Sven Obermeyer from Cheap Sheep Games, who put out things like Crimopolis, which I have covered on the channel. So if you're interested in that little Mafia game, go check out the video for that. And finally, in this segue, we've got the guys who have made Rugby the game and Cricket the game. And that's Zane Thompson of 0 Point Games. He's sports mad, he makes sports games. They're really simulationist games, but if you love these sports, definitely do check them out. Alright, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Te Reo Maori and the Maori world in general. So, Aotearoa is a country that was founded by a treaty, and part of this treaty was that the rights and culture of the indigenous people, the Maori of New Zealand, would be protected. So, Te Reo Maori is one of our official languages. So when I say at the start of a video, kia ora koto, what I am saying there is basically, hi ya all. Kia ora is hi, it can also be like, spot on, great job, I agree. And koto is what you put at the end of something to say, I'm addressing all of you. So, kia ora koto, hi to you all. You might have noticed a distinct lack of Maori designers in this list, and a part of that is because Maori game design is focused on something very different at the moment. You see, the language Te Reo Maori was essentially banned for generations. You weren't allowed to speak it in schools. If you did, you were beaten. So as a result, after several generations, it nearly died out in the cities. It was really kept alive in rural Maori communities. So Maori game designers are very much focused on language games and games that teach about the Maori way of doing things. So there's a couple out there that are really good. Te Karo, which is a language learning game. It's good for kids or anyone who's starting to pick up learning Te Reo Maori. And then there is Kaupapa. And Kaupapa is all about the Maori world, the Maori way of doing things, culture, protocols, the experience of the Maori world. So you won't see a lot of Maori game designs popping out into the rest of the Western world because their goals, for the most part, are quite different here. It's about restoring their language, restoring their culture, and, reclaiming a lot of stuff that was lost during colonialism. And frankly, that seems a lot more important than just selling a game to some people overseas. And to segue back, we'll just talk about Red Dust Rebellion briefly. That's my game. It's available for pre-order right now. It is a counterinsurgency game. It's set on Mars. And it's a very heavy, serious sort of game. So if you are into big, heavy, serious games, or like war games, or big conflict-heavy games, definitely take a look at it. Please buy my thing. And to change tack, while many games out there are very fancy, they've got cool models, they're flashy, they're very expensive, Regicide is a game that came out of Aotearoa that is very different. You can play this with a standard deck of cards. Now, Paul, Luke, and Andy from Badgers from Mars have done a standout job creating this small box, simple game that is really good solo and it's really good co-op. And the rules are available online, so if you do want to just grab a deck of cards and play it, you can, but I do recommend supporting the guys from Badgers from Mars for making this really cool design. And another one before I forget is Flesh and Blood, the incredibly successful collectible card game. That one comes out of Aotearoa as well. I've not played Flesh and Blood, collectible card games aren't really my jam, but I know this one has been a mega hit, especially over the last couple of years. So if you are into collectible card games and want an alternative to Magic, definitely check out Flesh and Blood. Alright, we've only got 2 publishers left, but they're probably the 2 most important ones inside the country. And we're going to start off with a friend of mine, Bobby Hill, who I worked with at the New Zealand Department of Conservation, and his game, Hadrian's Wall, published by Gale Games. I don't like roll and write games. I really just, I don't enjoy them. I like Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall is just so much better than the average roll and write fare. It's deep, it's got decisions, it feels thematic as well. Most of the roll and write genre to me just feels like a phone app game. Hadrian's Wall feels something significant. It feels meaty. And if you do like roll and write games, but you want something with a little bit more oomph, this is the game for you. And if you've tried roll and writes and thought, this is like playing a phone app, consider giving Hadrian's Wall a go. It converted me. I like it. I do prefer playing it solo though. I think roll and writes in a group are a weird experience because everyone's just staring at their bit of paper. But as a solo game, it is an absolute superstar. And of course, you don't have Gale Games without Shem Phillips. And of course, Shem Phillips' most famous and significant design would be Raiders of the North Sea, the game that put him on the map. And it's a combination of the really neat art direction in this game with the Maiko, plus Shem's cool place one worker, take one worker mechanic. Raiders is pretty much a modern classic, and it's a game that's helped him put out a whole bunch of other games to follow up with. Shem's name's on an awful lot of games in this video because he's probably New Zealand's most prolific designer. He doesn't do it all himself. He's got Sam McDonald, another friend of mine, and his solo design game I really like is Circadian's First Light, which is an excellent dice placement game. There's a lot to love in Circadians, there's plenty to do with your dice, you can roll low numbers, you can roll high numbers, there's always something to do, and then there's the variable player powers that are really, really strong, and they guide you towards a certain style of play, and they really reward you for playing that way. And I like variable player powers that aren't just like a +1 to this little thing. Variable player powers that make everyone else jealous of what you've got while you're jealous of what they've got. That's the sweet spot for me, and Circadians delivers here. Now, as the Paul McCartney and John Lennon of board game design in New Zealand, Shem and Sam are probably at their best when they're teaming up. Most noteworthy here is during the West Kingdom series, with Architects and Paladins in particular. Viscounts is okay, but I definitely prefer the first 2. And the game I want to focus on here is Paladins. I love games that let you chain things together. You know, you do one thing, which gets you a reward for that, and you can invest it in something else. And you feel ever so clever when you pull a plan together that involves chaining together resource after resource, token after token, to deliver a massive result. And Paladins of the West Kingdom is that game. It's a heavyweight Euro. You really need to like heavyweight games with lots of decisions in them to really get the best out of Paladins. But if you want something meaty and chunky to get your teeth into, hard to go wrong with it. Now, Shem did the North Sea series by himself, he's done the West Kingdom series alongside Sam, and they're now working on the South Tigris series. And the first game in that series is Wayfarers, and that went up on Kickstarter earlier this year. If you want to find out more about that, check out my video here. Now, many of you out there will probably think that Gale is the biggest, baddest publisher in Aotearoa, and they're probably the most critically acclaimed, no doubt about that. They've made a lot of really well-received games, but ultimately they're still very much a family business. There's only one board game publisher in Aotearoa that has their own office building and their own factory store. And this one might surprise some people. You see, many years ago, some people up in Auckland decided to make a war game, and that war game was Flames of War. This is a World War II game, lots of miniatures and tanks and units, and it became the most successful historic miniatures war game out there in the market. And they used this prodigious amount of money to buy a company called Gale Force 9. And Gale Force 9 is based out of Auckland, New Zealand, and puts out a crap load of games. Some of the more well-known ones will be Star Trek Ascendancy, Spartacus, A Game of Blood and Treachery, Firefly the Game, all of the June games, Aliens Another Glorious Day in the Core, Doctor Who Time of the Daleks, and the game I'm going to look at, Tyrants of the Underdark. Gale Force 9 also do a bunch of scenery and other stuff for tabletop gaming. Tyrants of the Underdark was an instant hit for me because it solved the problem I have with deck building games. And that is that deck building in and of itself seems kind of meh to me. Deck building with a purpose, now that's something I can get into. And Tyrants of the Underdark combines area control with deck building, and it does it sublimely well. There's a lot of clever game mechanics within the deck building, but they have a direct effect on the board while you're playing the game. It's not just can I collect the most gold and score the most victory points in my deck to win, it's can I translate the stuff that I put in my deck into gameplay on the board to do stuff. And that for me is the difference between an average deck building game and a great deck building hybrid game. So anyway, that's my list, and no doubt I've forgotten a bunch of other designers and publishers operating out of Aotearoa. There's also a lot of games coming up, and a lot of people in the Game Artisans of New Zealand group who are working towards either making their first game or publishing their first game or just getting their ideas out there and testing people. We have a great community here of designers who get together, we play test each other's games, we talk about them on Facebook, and generally try to create a collegial, supportive environment. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tour of the board game designers and publishers of Aotearoa New Zealand. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the notification button, like, share, and subscribe to the channel.